In the late summer of 1779, the forests of upstate New York were on fire. An army of 4,000 men cut a swath through the land, looting, burning, pillaging, and killing as they marched from village to village, slaughtering all in their path. Some historians have claimed that Sullivan's expedition had one goal: the extermination of the Iroquois. Others, namely the preeminent historian Fred Anderson, have argued that the expedition was more akin to a campaign of ethnic cleansing. Academic idiosyncrasies aside, the expedition marks the first time the new United States launched a concerted, state-sanctioned campaign of violence against Native Americans. And it is the man who gave his namesake to this dark chapter in American history, General John Sullivan, whose story we will share today. Welcome to America's Forgotten Founders, where we will look at people whose contributions to the American Revolution, whether on the battlefield, in the halls of power, or on the home front, have been all but forgotten by the annals of history. John Sullivan was the third son of Irish settlers in Somersworth, in what was then the province of New Hampshire, on February 17, 1740. His father, Philip O. Sullivan, worked as a schoolteacher. Due to his father's position, John and his siblings received a proper education. By the time he was 18, the well-educated young man would be clerking for Samuel Livermore, a prominent lawyer in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. While working for Mr. Livermore, John fell in love with Lydia Remick Worcester, and the two were married in 1760. The couple would have 6 children, with 4 surviving into adulthood. His apprenticeship over by late 1763, the new lawyer decided to move his family to Durham, New Hampshire, where he started his own legal practice. John quickly became the town's most hated man. This vain and ambitious man, the only lawyer in the area, would graciously lend his neighbors money and then, almost as soon as the loan was made, sue for repayment, with interest, of course. His lust for wealth was so great that in June 1766, a petition to save the residents of Durham from the oppressive, extortive behavior of one Mr. John Sullivan was presented to the General Court with 133 signatures. While nothing would ultimately come of the petition, it, along with twice being attacked by mobs, would do nothing to curb his behavior. By 1772, John had prosecuted and won 35 cases, earning himself a hefty £3,000. He also invested heavily into the local milling industry, turning a nice profit. While pursuing his neighbors, John found time to join the Grand Lodge of New Hampshire in 1767. He would eventually become the first Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge later in life. By 1772, John had achieved financial security. He used this newfound stability to focus on repairing his reputation with the local community. His motivations, however, were not altruistic. If he were ever to pursue a political career, he would, after all, need the support of the people. To this end, John began cultivating a friendship with the royal governor of New Hampshire, John Wentworth. This paid off. By November 1772, a pretty busy year for John, he was commissioned a major in the New Hampshire militia. As tensions between the British and the American colonists intensified, John began quietly distancing himself from Governor Wentworth. By the time New Hampshire sent its delegation to the First Continental Congress in July 1774, he strongly supported the early revolutionary movement. Despite his apparent support, it remains unclear whether his motivations were rooted more in a desire to challenge British authority or to gain greater personal power in the ensuing power vacuum. Regardless of his motivations, however, the young lawyer would be appointed a delegate to the First Continental Congress, where he advocated for the need to split from Great Britain. He would irrevocably commit himself to the American cause on December 15, 1774, by leading a raid on Fort William and Mary in Newcastle to secure arms and munitions for the militia. His credentials as a passionate patriot earned him the honor of being chosen as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress in 1775. There, he continued to voice his unwavering support for the separation of the American colonies from Great Britain. On June 22, 1775, despite having little military experience, John Sullivan was able to leverage his raid on Fort William and Mary to obtain a brigadier general's commission in the Continental Army. By mid-1776, General Sullivan was sent by General Washington to lead the remnants of the failed 1775 invasion of Quebec as they retreated from the British across Canada and New York. Assuming command of a demoralized, exhausted, and undersupplied army, Sullivan was forced to withdraw his men back from the U.S.-Canadian border after their defeat at the Battle of Trois-Rivières. Despite this failure, Congress made John a major general on August 9, 1776. He was immediately dispatched to rejoin Washington's army around New York City. About this time, Washington, writing to a friend about Sullivan, described him as possessing a little tincture of vanity, an over-desire of being popular, which now and then leads him into some embarrassments. On August 20th, shortly after John arrived in New York City, Nathaniel Greene, weakened by illness, handed over the command of the troops protecting Long Island to Washington. Washington, in turn, dispatched Major General Sullivan to take over Greene's post. Just 6 days later, during the Battle of Long Island on August 26th, General Sullivan's 1,800 men were caught in the middle of a British Hessian pincer at Battle Pass. Though the situation was dire, General Sullivan managed to direct most of his men to retreat in decent order while he led a rearguard action. During the action, the defiant general, holding an empty pistol in each hand, was captured by Hessian troops. While a prisoner, he was convinced by General Howe to act as an intermediary on behalf of the British to the Continental Congress. Howe wanted the fighting to end and thought a conference between British and American representatives might do the trick. Though Sullivan took the offer to Congress, many of the delegates were unimpressed. Though they ultimately agreed to fruitless negotiations with the British to save face, many were upset that Sullivan decided to bring them the message in the first place. John Adams called Sullivan a decoy duck, whom Lord Howe had sent among us to seduce us into a renunciation of our independence. He further commented how he wished the first ball that had been fired at Long Island had gone through Sullivan's head. Formally exchanged just 3 months later for a British officer, Sullivan was able to command the right flank of Washington's army during the Battle of Trenton on Christmas Day. During the raid, General Sullivan's troops prevented a Hessian withdrawal by controlling the single bridge across the Assunpink Creek. The Hessian forces, who were both outnumbered and caught totally unprepared, found their only line of retreat cut off. With no other option, they surrendered en masse. The victory at Trenton provided a much-needed morale boost to the Continental Army, to Congress, and to Patriot sympathizers throughout the colonies. Sullivan, however, didn't seem to care much about the Army's victory. John would spend the better part of 1777 arguing with everyone and anyone about how unfair it was he hadn't received another promotion. Washington grew increasingly tired of Sullivan's complaints. Washington wrote to him during the summer that he need not torment himself any longer with imaginary slights. No other officer of rank in the whole army has so often conceived himself neglected, slighted, and ill-treated as you have done, and none, I am sure, has had less cause than yourself to entertain such ideas. The power-hungry Sullivan remained unsatisfied. In an attempt to quench his thirst for ever greater prestige, he launched a disastrous raid against British-held Staten Island on August 22, 1777. While he would justify the raid by claiming he had received faulty intelligence that the British garrison was weak, in reality the battle was little more than a thinly veiled attempt to satiate his own appetite for glory. The British lost 5 men and 7 were wounded. The Americans lost 10 Soldiers, 20 were wounded, and anywhere from 150 to 259 were captured. The British captured over 20 American officers. Though he was tried via a court of inquiry over the battle, he was acquitted in time to participate in the battles of Germantown and Brandywine. Despite performing well at Germantown, at Brandywine, his unit was flanked and fled the field. Despite once again being heavily criticized by members of Congress, John was sent to Rhode Island in early 1778 to command a mixed force of Continental regulars and Rhode Island militiamen in seizing the strategically vital port of Newport. The plan was for a powerful Franco-American force to deprive the garrison of all means of escape and resupply, both by land and sea, and force them to surrender. This plan, however, fell apart when the blockading French fleet under the Comte d'Estaing was severely damaged in a storm and forced to withdraw to Boston for repairs. This failed operation marked the first time French and American forces attempted to fight side by side. With a British relief fleet on the way, Sullivan grudgingly called off the campaign. The night his men withdrew, they were attacked by the British at the Battle of Rhode Island. Despite the surprise assault, the force retreated in good order and avoided leaving behind any supplies. The successful withdrawal did little to calm John's anger. Sullivan refused to accept any blame for the defeat, blaming the Comte. He even went so far as to accuse the Comte of actions that were derogatory to the honor of France. While the Comte was seemingly unfazed by Sullivan's explosive temper, King Louis XVI and his Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Comte de Vergennes, were not. They were livid and threatened to terminate the Franco-American alliance. Congress, as well as Washington, were able to smooth things over with the French in the end and preserve the alliance. Sullivan's childlike tirade nearly wrecked the fragile alliance between France and the newly formed United States even before it began. After John's defeat in Rhode Island, Congress tapped him to command an expedition against the British allied Iroquois in upstate New York in response to several raids against American settlements. The operation was to take place during the summer of 1779. Washington gave General Sullivan his orders at the end of May. The expedition you are appointed to command is to be directed against the hostile tribes of the Six Nations of Indians with their associates and adherents. The immediate objects are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and prevent their planting more. Washington granted Sullivan with the authority to set the terms of a preliminary peace treaty with the Iroquois. Washington goes on to clarify, however, that such a treaty may only be signed after the total ruin of their settlements is effected. Still as eager as ever to win glory for himself, Sullivan was happy to oblige. From June to October 1779, his forces went on a rampage. Sullivan claims his men destroyed over 40 villages, including Catherinestown, Goaguen, Chanodote, and Canadesega. All crops were either consumed by the ravaging American troops or promptly burnt. All in all, over 160,000 bushels of corn were destroyed. The troops did not distinguish between friend and foe during this ruthless march. Although the Mohawks at Teantalago were allied with the Patriots, the entire male population was still interned, and the settlement promptly burned to the ground. As the expedition was in progress, a British-aligned Mohawk leader, Joseph Brant, warned his people that the Continental sought to exterminate the people of the Long House. Whether or not Sullivan intended to lead a campaign of extermination, that's what it ultimately became. Modern estimates believe over 50% of the Iroquois were killed directly by the Continental troops or died from disease, starvation, and exposure during the winter. His grand campaign of death and destruction completed, General Sullivan expected to receive the praise and admiration of Congress. When he got neither, the general, already in poor health, resigned from the Continental Army in November 1779. Despite being snubbed at the national level, John Sullivan was a hero in his home state. Immediately after he left the Army, he was appointed to represent New Hampshire in the Second Continental Congress. While there, he would take a loan from the French minister to Congress, a loan he never had the intention of repaying. Resigning a month before his term was over, he returned to New Hampshire. The self-aggrandizing man was still beloved by his fellow citizens. He was the state's attorney general from 1782 to 1786. While serving as Attorney General, he also acted as the Speaker of the New Hampshire Assembly. Despite his bitter relationship with many national figures, he was appointed one of the 31 inaugural members of the Society of the Cincinnati for New Hampshire on November 18, 1783. He would be the president of the New Hampshire Society until he resigned in 1793. After his term as Attorney General ended, he was elected President, later Governor, of New Hampshire from 1786 to 1789. After serving 3 terms as President of New Hampshire, John Sullivan was appointed to the United States District Court for the District of New Hampshire in September 1789 by George Washington. Sullivan would hold that position until his death. Never wanting to be second fiddle to anyone, Sullivan was unhappy serving in lowly New Hampshire. He again became involved in petty feuds with his neighbors in Durham, taking many of them to court. The bitter, sickly man also became a heavy drinker. His alcoholism did little to improve his already failing health. By the end of his life, most of his friends had abandoned him as he approached a state of idiocy wherein he could neither feed, dress, or undress himself. He let his house fall apart around him. John Sullivan died in a drunken stupor in Durham on January 23, 1795, at the age of 54. He was buried in the family cemetery in Durham. John Sullivan was a man whose insatiable greed was surpassed only by his limitless ambition. Never content with his lot in life, he always wanted more, whether it be wealth, power, or glory. Many of his soldiers died not in service to their country, but in a vain attempt to satisfy their commander's hubris. He was a relatively poor military commander. Though he was undoubtedly brave, bravery alone does not win battles, let alone wars. His greatest victory during the war was the destruction of dozens of villages, hundreds of homes, and thousands of lives. Historians debate whether the expedition he gave his name to was either genocide or ethnic cleansing. Genocide, as defined in the 1948 United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Ethnic cleansing, on the other hand, is the systematic forced removal of ethnic, racial, and religious groups from a given area. In other words, while ethnic cleansing may result in the direct or indirect death of members of an ethnic, racial, or religious group, destroying that group is not the goal. In genocide, the goal is, ultimately, to eradicate an ethnic, racial, or religious group. Ultimately, however, this debate on whether the expedition was a full-scale genocide or ethnic cleansing is asinine. If you're standing among the ashes of 40 burned villages strewn with the bodies of men, women, and children, does it really matter what terms scholars give the event? Does this classification really matter to the gaunt and hollow-eyed survivors languishing in the snow, waiting for death to release them from their suffering? Sullivan's expedition ultimately set the stage for future American-Native relations, which would result in the near eradication of countless lives and several nations during the following 150 years. I hope you found this video both informative and exciting. Please make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. And join us next time as we look at our next forgotten figure, the vulgar Major General Israel Putnam.